welcome to this very special interaction with Mr. Raghuram Rajan, former RBI governor and world-renowned economist. Mr. Rajan, thank you so much for spending time with Mirror Now.
Thanks for having me.
I know you've done a series of interviews over the last 48 hours, so you must be exhausted, but I do want to talk to you about the book. It's a very interesting look at how communities can support each other and how communities can promote equality and growth, and how modern communities have sort of led to a breakdown of that. There's an interesting reference here, which I thought was quite charming, of the South Indian wedding, where age is the most important thing and not anything else. Do you believe that somehow, given where India came from, with references like that all over the country, that somehow today we've let that fall apart? Is it the lack of education, the lack of equality?
No, I think tradition has its value.
Yes.
And in many communities in India, we still respect that tradition. That's very useful. Of course, as you move into the cities, some of that tradition breaks down, and parents despair of their children who no longer follow those ways of living. But ultimately, change needs to be accommodated, and we have to recreate new traditions, new ways of living in communities. I mean, what is interesting is that need for social relationships keeps coming back, and in very cosmopolitan cities in the West, for example, where people come from very, very different places and aren't anchored by the tradition of their youth, they reform new communities through new structures. So the school, for example, in my neighborhood in Hyde Park is very important for people to establish contact with each other. They're far more friendly with the parents of the kids their children go to school with than more generally other people in the neighborhood. And they go to each other's houses, they form friendships. So communities rebuild around different things, even if the old traditions are lost.
With your permission, if I may focus on India, we've had free and compulsory primary education, at least in India, for several years, but it hasn't made a dent. Is that because of the lack of quality, or is it the lack of political will? What are we doing wrong?
No, I think as the ASER tests that Pratham and its affiliates conduct suggest, quality is shockingly low in some areas. And if in 5th grade or 7th grade you can read at the 3rd grade level and not more, then we are not preparing those kids for the kind of world that they will come out into. And moreover, I think one is education, the other is even nutrition and healthcare. I mean, we have so many kids who don't get appropriate nutrition.
Yes.
And so the net effect is that the level of schooling that our children come out with is not that good.
So effectively you're saying the lack of good quality or any sort of quality education and healthcare is dooming and sentencing people to a lifetime of poverty and marginalization.
Exactly. It is a sentence. That's the appropriate word. And when you look at India versus China, some of the studies that I've seen suggest one of the big differences is the quality of education, even at the outset of reforms. And that difference continues to. China had a much stronger basic level of education and much more widely spread. Of course, with the change in China, access is also shifting to really high quality education.
But in your book, you're not fully convinced with the American capitalist model, nor are you fully convinced that China's model is working either. Does it have to be a middle ground between the two?
Well, the book emphasizes balance, and actually I'm more persuaded in the commonalities between a market system and democracy, which the liberal market system post-World War in the West provided. It seems to me that is also India's natural home, where we should be going. That is, have a vibrant private sector, but also have democracy ensure that the opportunities created by the economy are widely available. And you can see again and again, certainly from the examples I give in the book, that democracy is a very important factor in this equilibrium. And people who want to take bits and pieces who say, you know, we want the democracy, but we don't want a private sector. We want a totally socialist economy. It doesn't work. I mean, name one socialist economy which is a vibrant democracy. What democracy does, in my view, is it separates the private sector from becoming dominated by the government and vice versa, because it keeps the level of cronyism and corruption in check. And again you see in the, certainly in the history of some of these developed countries, that it is the scandal that is created by cronyism that is opposed by democratic.
So I do want to ask you this now. The American system has, by trial and error, perhaps reached a point where the lobbyism is out in the open, where the political funding is out in the open, everything is declared. India has not. In fact, in the last several years, our political funding has become even more opaque. Do you believe that if we're going to look towards the West for examples, this is something that we need to focus on? Because a lot of the crony capitalism can be hidden in political funding.
Right. No, I think I mean, it's a path.
Yes.
We are moving towards more transparency. We don't always take, no steps backwards and only steps forward. Mm-hmm. Sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, but we're steadily moving there. I mean, think about the right to information bill.
Yes.
Which was a very important bill in trying to open up the workings of the government. Now, that was the action. Then we got the reaction, which is we got, habitual people who want information on everything and then sometimes misuse it because some employee has a grievance and then wants to push that grievance forward and through the right to information. And so there's action, there's reaction, there's further action. Eventually we will reach an equilibrium where in fact it works itself out in such a way that yes, the citizenry has that right to information, gets appropriately informed, and the government is constrained by that. I know that at the RBI, for example, we did worry about how actions would look in public, yes, because we knew that there was a right to information possibility that we'd have to answer to.
But I mean, just because you mentioned it, the Supreme Court, in fact, just yesterday has pulled up the RBI for not complying to the Supreme Court's instructions on the Right to Information Act. The RBI still stands with its stand. It doesn't apply to us.
As I understand it, there is an issue, and I don't want to go to the details because it is obviously sub judice. But the issue really is in your inspections, you can uncover a lot which is not available to the public. And if the public doesn't have all the information to interpret that particular this thing that you've uncovered, whether in fact that may cause apprehension, which is undue. So in other words, information without the knowledge to process it, right, may be.
But to be fair, that's an argument that could be made by anybody. The Ministry of Defense.
That is why I think the court will have to weigh this and decide whether this is something that can be exposed.
In your book, you've talked about, like you said, bringing equality through opportunities through education. You just mentioned healthcare as well. There was an Oxfam report just before Davos, which talked about the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor in India has gotten much worse. What I found interesting is at the end of the report, it basically said that if you were to ensure education, opportunity, and healthcare, then a lot of the savings that's currently going into these 3 things will then be used. You'll take that off the mind of the poor, and they'll be able to focus then on moving forward. The other option is, and it's being talked about a lot, is minimum income support. Which of the 2 routes do you think? I mean, the first route is much longer, but which of the 2 routes do you think would work in India?
As I talk, as I say in the book, you need 2 parts of support to a market economy. You need capability building so that people don't enter the market economy when they're born. Yes. They enter once they're prepared for it, which means education, adequate health care, etc., so that they can participate in an active way. If your child hasn't had the education, has had malnutrition, what position are they in to essentially participate in the economy? And that's why industrial countries over time have built that basic sort of capability building structure. At the same time, if you fall off, if you have
Drop
some
out.
disabilities, if you have bad luck, if there's a calamity that hits and businesses go out, shut down in a big way, what kind of safety net do you have? Again, industrial countries have built that safety net over time. We are a developing country, but we have to think about both these aspects. On the one hand, capability building, on the other hand, something to support those who fall off. And I think both are continuous dialogue.
You've said some fairly strong things about nationalism. Specifically, you have mentioned the RSS as well. If I may, you said the truly committed majoritarian Hindu leader drawn from a young age into the RSS is usually personally austere, which endears him to those who dislike corruption, and he's committed to the cause, which makes him ruthless in his methods. They're a serious threat to liberal, tolerant, innovative India. Is anyone specific you're
No,
look, but you believe nationalism is bad for us.
Let me be it's very clear here. I'm not saying that every RSS person is in this mold. It's the objectives of an organization that I think are opposed generally to the syncretic nature of India, which I worry about. And of course, there are people who belong to the RSS who are national treasures, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, for example. The broader concern I have is that in an India which essentially has to promote unity amongst its various minorities, amongst its various ethnicities, amongst its various religions, that a focus on majoritarianism, which in many ways is the creed of a variety of nationalist organizations, I think will be problematic going forward. It will create more dissension, more conflict in unnecessary ways, when in fact we need to focus, if we think about nation building, on creating economic growth. And economic growth requires much more of a social consensus. And to my mind, social consensus imposed by the majority is not really the way to go.
You've also said that there is a protectionist streak in some Hindu nationalists fueled by their business backers, and in brackets you've said they have ties to businesses despite their seeming austerity. So you do believe that this sort of nationalism comes with its share, if not more than its share, of corruption?
Not corruption. I'm not saying that people are personally on the take here. I do mean they have backers. The organization has backers. That there is a protectionist sort of wing of the Indian entrepreneurial sort of establishment. And they have their favorites in every political sort of entity. And there are within this nationalist structure also, protectionists. And so they get backing.
You just described crony capitalism.
Well, these aren't always people in power. When they are in power, yes, you could argue there is some cronyism there. But when they're out of power, it's a faction which is pushing towards protectionism, towards sort of Indian rules. And often Indian rules favor specific entities and are not just protectionism, but biased in terms of favoring particular entities.
Do you believe that the current regime, because it is nationalist, it is backed by the RSS, it does have specific backers and supporters, do you believe that there is this sort of push for protectionism or cronyism happening in this current government?
I think first, I do think that we have made some significant positive improvements in terms of, auctioning contracts and this and that. But I do think that we also have taken some retrograde steps, tariffs, for example, yes, that we have enhanced. And now, we need a much more transparent process of why and how tariffs are elevated, because otherwise we go back to the old sort of protectionist regime where, there was a lot of murkiness on how the tariffs were raised and in which commodities and in which goods. This is an issue also in the United States today,
yes,
that those who have access to the administration have a much easier time raising tariffs on their competitors. And thus imposing costs on everybody else.
You've talked about nostalgic nationalism, and there is, of course, a large people in business right now who seem austere but are in business. They're talking about how companies that come from around the world are actually like the East India Company. They've come to take over, and it's actually just Indian companies that should do well, and you should only buy from Indian companies. I'm referring specifically to Baba Ramdev and the company that he fronts, Patanjali. Do you believe that that sort of thinking and speaking is bad for us?
I think we got away from that in '91 with the reforms, and I think we should stay that way. Now, I think the more we sort of say we're going to have Indian champions, the more we create the possibility of essentially not doing the best for our consumers, that elevating costs. By all means, we need very productive Indian companies also. I'm not saying we should be biased against them. We should not enter into trade deals which are biased against our companies. We should try and open more markets to them. But if we elevate costs by protecting one segment of our industry, yes, then we render uncompetitive other segments of industry. So that route we followed in the past, yes, and it was not growth enhancing.
So one of the segments that is extremely controlled is agriculture. The government controls who can buy and sell the land. It controls who can sell the produce, who you can sell it to, at what price. The government is actually buying and selling and distributing. Do you believe that that is perhaps detrimental to the good of the farmers?
We need significant agricultural reforms, and we need to make it such that agriculture is a really productive business, and that it becomes a growth engine for the economy. I mean, we are the largest milk producer in the world. There are a variety of commodities, rice, for example, in which we are the largest. There is a question about whether we should be in the business of producing so much rice given the water that it consumes.
Yes.
But the broader point is, how can we make agriculture an engine of growth? And how can, instead of being what everybody wants to subsidize in this way, that way, and you make this ban, that ban, and something else. So we need to think very carefully about that. There are a number of people, Ashok Gulati, for example, who've written a lot on the kinds of changes that we need in agriculture to make it much more sustainable. And we need to really think about that, because agricultural distress is a big issue.
We've actually reached an acute distress point for agriculture, because a lot again of our reporters who travel and come back with stories tell us that smaller farmers with smaller pieces of land just find it unviable right now. It's no longer a business that makes sense. We're talking again about farm loan waivers, and I know that for you this has always been, you haven't really backed it as an idea that has worked for the farmer, let alone for anyone else. Are you personally disappointed to see us make an entire circle and go back there again? Because we've had opportunities to fix things.
We need to go forward in agriculture, not as you said, in this entire circle. Part of the problem is, as you said, these small farms can be very unproductive, especially if there's no link to value-added work on those farms. It is possible to make relatively small farms very productive, but you can't grow the same things that you grow elsewhere. You have to do something else. That said, I think part of the problem is the exit from agriculture. What do people go into? And are they prepared for those kinds of we're creating, perhaps service jobs in restaurants, hotels, and so on. Can somebody leave the farm to go into those jobs? What kinds of preparation do they need? Can we create jobs that is more natural for people to go into? Construction, for example. We could certainly try and expand construction significantly. Many countries have grown on that basis. So we need to think very carefully about the whole job creation process.
I do want to ask you this question. You've said some very strong things about anti-immigration laws and countries that are closing their borders, or countries that are being in some way racially or religiously puritanical, and saying that we won't let anyone in. Again, you believe that this is detrimental. And this is happening across the world, in the West, in the US, in Europe. There are several countries that are now saying, we will not let immigrants in.
Right.
Will that mean that those economies then begin to rot from the inside out?
Practically, it's practically impossible for them to shut down immigration. But the thought is we're going to make it a trickle. And that's where they're not thinking into the future, because they have aging populations. And with aging populations, as we can see in the case of Japan, you can't replace all the people who are leaving the workforce with getting more women. That's one option, more participation by women. You can go some way, getting the elderly to stay on a little longer. But ultimately, the answer seems to be robots. But robots just don't cut it at this point. They're not able to do the work that people do. So if you really want to support your aging population, you need young people, and you need young people who are bought into the system. You can't suddenly, when you've got a massive old population, say, oh, we need young people now to support the elderly. They're going to be frightened off by the level of taxes, etc. they'll have to pay to support these elderly. So I think countries have to make a choice early on. Countries that already have some level of immigration need to think about how they can get more. But many of these countries, I think, would move towards a more controlled immigration structure if they could get that control. The problem in Europe right now is, how do you get back control over the process? As in the United States, how do we prevent our borders from being swamped by people who come for economic reasons and who don't have the skills?
But do you believe, and you live in the States right now, do you believe that this sort of fear-based us versus them type politics that we're seeing happen across the world right now is dangerous?
It is.
Not just economically, but it's dangerous basically to the fiber of communities and civilization.
It is, and I mean, you mentioned the RSS, but my broader concern is about populist nationalism anywhere, because the way it builds sort of a kind of solidarity is amongst fairly diverse people, because the majoritarian, to become a majority, has to bring together very diverse people. The way it builds that solidarity, whether it's white nationalism or Turkish nationalism, is by pointing to the enemy and creating a very distinct enemy. Often that enemy is internal. It is a minority. It is an ethnicity that you say are the other, and these are the people you have to be scared about. And of course, that creates tensions. We've seen those happen in Turkey, and going forward, it also creates tensions between countries, not just within the country.
So I actually crowdsourced some questions on Twitter this morning, and I asked people if they have something to ask you. I got over 1,000 responses. I'm not going to ask you 1,000 questions, but I'll ask you the ones that were most popular. The most popular one was, would you accept a position as finance minister or prime minister of India if offered?
Yeah, no, it's delightful to be asked this question, and my answer has always been the same. I'm not a politician, and I'm very happy being a academic. It's a great profession. It allows you to write books.
But I mean, you did talk about service. That you were always available to service to India. So let's assume as advisor to government.
I'm happy to provide advice, serve in any capacity. It's just that I'm not a politician.
If you were offered or given the opportunity to bring in some solutions right now to fix India's problems of poverty, of the lack of education, jobs and farms, what would be your first go-to solution? What would you think the solution would be for India right now?
See, I think as far as jobs go, we need to start thinking about what would be the relatively easy way to produce jobs. And when I say relatively easy, I'm not saying it's easy, because otherwise we'd have done it.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the way at this point is infrastructure, construction, expand that, affordable housing, roads, airports. How do you do that? Why haven't we done that already? I think we need to take a very close look at our land acquisition process. If we can make that both fair but also more quick than we have now, by looking at best practices among states, I think we can enhance that. Of course, construction also needs financing. We need to look at our financial system. What kind of financing has it provided? Financing of construction has been very murky so far. Can we clean that up to make it more available? Those are the kinds of things that I think would restore some modicum of growth. Of course, we also have a lot of stalled projects.
Yes.
Can we finish them? I mean, just
in
coming
power
into
and
Mumbai,
yes.
look at the number of buildings which are, there is no construction going on, but which are 3/4 erected. Can we actually finish some of that? But all this, to my mind, could help significantly elevate the possibility of jobs as well as growth.
Do you believe our banking sector is worse off now than it was 4 or 5 years ago? Has it gotten worse?
I mean,
have we gotten better?
Typically, we don't go backwards. We may not go
shouldn't,
forwards
yes.
at the same pace that we would want. But I would say, in general, we have made progress.
Last question: are you consulting with any of the political parties on their manifestos? Yes or no?
I talk to anybody who wants to talk to me.
Fair enough, Mr. Rajan. Many thanks and congratulations on the book. We wish you good luck.
Thank you very much.